feels a little bit appropriate that we're talking about technology and art in some of these presentations, and of course we're having issues getting connected to a basic PC. So such is life. My name is Michael Timkew. I teach art history at the University of Essex. I'm also the academic lead for the university's digital, cultural, and creative initiatives. And it's with great pleasure that we're going to be continuing our discussion about art and culture as a driver in placemaking and leveling up. We had a really thought-provoking session in the morning about stimulating engagement. This session is going to be focusing on more practice. It's subtitled A Practitioner's Roundtable. We're going to hear 3 presentations about different projects. What the idea is to, after each presentation, maybe open it up for just 1 or 2 questions that are about that specific project, that are burning questions that you might have. And then after that, we're going to invite representatives of each of the 3 projects for a roundtable discussion, and that's really what this is meant to be. So I do encourage, those things are only as good as the questions that are asked. So do come with whatever stimulating questions you have. So we're going to start with the first presentation, which is AR Scapes, Voices from the Concrete Barges, which will be given by Kate McLean. Her colleagues, Richard Perks, also from Kent, was unable to attend, and Rosa, Woolf, Ainley from the RCA was also unable to attend. So Kate is delivering this solo. I'll let her explain about the project, but I wanted to just give everybody's bios because I know it's sort of annoying, but I was so interested in the different research projects that they were doing. And if one of the goals of Eastern Arc is to make people think about ways of possibly collaborating, some of those possible collaborations might not be evident in the actual presentations. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to be cribbing some of the bio stuff that you wrote, but and the others wrote as well later. Kate works at the intersection of human perceived smellscapes, cartography, and the communication of eye-invisible sensed data. To achieve this, she leads international public smell walks and translates the resulting data using digital design, watercolor, animation, scent diffusion, and sculpture into smell maps, showcasing the invisible world of smells. How cool. Kate, and I'll gloss over the education stuff in the interest of time. Kate has an international profile and is often invited as a speaker at workshops and conferences around the world, across a range of fields from landscape architecture to design, olfactory heritage to sensory studies. She's also worked to promote the understanding of anosmia, which I had to look up, which is the partial or full loss of smell, or parasmia. I'm butchering the pronunciation, but we'll tolerate this just once. The misperception of an odor, and she's done this for various international charitable organizations. At the University of Kent, Kate leads the graphic design program within the School of Art, Architecture, and Planning. So I welcome Kate to share with us this project.
Thank you very much for bearing with us, and I will now run through very quickly an interesting project that interestingly does not actually include any smells in it at this stage. It was a chance to actually move away from it, and thanks to the Creative Estuary Ideas Lab for funding us. 3 of us got together, so Rich Perks and Rosa Ainley and myself, and we've developed this really as a site-specific piece, which basically looks at a methodology for taking ideas from local heritage and creating something quite unique and original in terms of enabling sort of like new audiences and access to those sites and actually calling them out. It was tried to enable the ideas of future heritage to be built into this, which is something that I'm working with olfactory heritage as well, to allow the actual sites themselves to speak. And it was about using new technologies. So another thing that I'm interested in doing is developing ways of communicating smellscapes, but this was a way to sort of like to use a project to sort of ride that through. Many estuary sites go unnoticed. I think this is on a timed thing, so it's going to tell me when it wants to go, and I'm going to tell it to go back again. So many estuary sites go unnoticed, and this was particularly one of them. Can I just see, out of curiosity, has anybody been there? It's skipped again, hasn't it? I'm going to sit here and look at it. The concrete barges is in Rainham in Essex, and they are a wonderful, wonderful anomaly. They were first developed, they are made out of concrete, they may not look like it, and they were made during the war, Second World War, as a way of transporting materials to ships, because there was all the metal had been used. So they carried petrol, they carried all sorts of things. Then after the floods in 1953, they were used on the edges of the banks here to actually shore up the estuary to stop coastal flooding, to stop estuary flooding. So I will now tell it nicely to go here. So what were we trying to do? You can read as well as I can. We were trying to give the context to that estuary space. Our lens is interdisciplinary arts, and we're all practitioners. Looking at augmenting that space through use of creative media, and really using the technologies or exploring how they might be used to just enable different people to be able to get to and access and understand these spaces and be interested in them. The other part of it is looking at it from different perspectives. So we see this as potentially a historical project, or you'd see it as a site-specific placemaking, but actually there are multiple audiences and multiple inhabitants of those barges. So it's looking at the voices that might emanate from those spaces over time. We really wanted to, and we did, use local communities in order to be able to generate the materials for this. And part of it, which is what I wanted to do today, is to get some feedback from you about whether you think it works. Be brutally honest. It might not, you might go, no, please forget it now, but this is the whole point of the project, is to find out if it has legs, whether it's worthy of sort of like going on to phase 2. So really, it is a prototype. Our backgrounds, and this is linked to the different elements of the project as well. Rich is a performance musician and specialises in the fretless guitar. That doesn't feature in this project either. And Rich, over lockdown, had walked out from where he lived, and we all live on the estuary at different places. He'd walked out and he'd found the concrete barges about 2 miles from where he lived. And this is what they look like from the air. They look like little seeds on Google that have been dropped. Rosa is a text-based artist, and she writes architectural spaces. And she's written about through the old Pfizer plant in Sandwich in Kent, as well as her PhD was based in the Alexandra Palace. Sorry, Rosa, give you a little bit of background there. Rosa is really interested in the ideas about heritage, whose voices they are, whose heritage, whose narrative it is. And also both of us sort of like connect through the idea of place, and again sort of like refuting the essentialist ideas of place and really seeking to find out how that is defined. That's an example of the sort of stuff that I normally do. And so my interest is in making the invisible and the intangible visible. So really thinking about ways that we can use our senses to communicate and understand place. Hello phone, where are we at now? Thank you very much. So the other part of this was to use augmented reality, otherwise known as mixed reality. How many of you play Pokemon Go? Yay! Yeah, okay. So that's how you might use it. Also, IKEA now use it in order to be able to, for you to be able to pick a piece of furniture, place it in your room to see if it actually goes where you think it might go. It's kind of cool. It's like to refer to it as mixed reality rather than augmented. Augmented makes it sound sort of like, hey, we're making the world better, and actually all we're doing is we're overlaying a digital component on top of a landscape. And we had no idea how it worked. So it was a really good way of actually finding out how to get that to go through. The main sort of like research methods through this was ethnographic, so we really did look at site visits. We went up for 2 site visits, one with the tide out. This is part of the estuary idea and concept. What you can see here is you can see the sort of like the mud flats. You can see a gantry, a sort of like a channel behind there. That's from the Tilda rice factory that makes rice and sticks it into packets for sale in the supermarkets. And here are the barges, and I think there's about 15 of them. They're all placed, or they've moved slightly, but they're very much sort of like stuck in their mud. They don't move. And then we visited again at another time, a couple of months later, and this is what they look like when it's high tide. So at this point, their inhabitants change. So there are a number of creatures that we looked at, and you're just down the sort of like the road here from RSPB Purfleet, which is an architectural wonder as well as being sort of like a big site for bird watching. So you've got the water pipit, which is a recent sort of like convert and lives around these barges. You've also got water voles that live there. You've got field mice, you've got dog walkers, you've got humans, you've got the barges themselves, and you've got the other river users, just to sort of like give this sort of like a greater sense of environment. The other part of going down there was we found this project that nobody actually claims. So it's sort of like a hidden art project, and if anybody knows any more about it, I would love to find out. But you've got the signs, you've got the classic hazard warning signs that somebody's defaced, you've got the one that says soft mud because you really don't want to be sinking, and you've got the walkways signs sort of like indicating where the paths go. You've then got a project which is all about pirates that is a sort of like a local anomaly, and it is brilliant. All along the fencing there are all these poetic forms, signs that have been made about pirates, pirate pets, Spot the Dog Departed, Good Old Fred. So it shows that this is a site that is used and is curious and does have an attraction for other people as well as us. The other methodology that we looked at was the idea of plurality, so actually developing these alternative voices, not just looking at it from the human perspective, but really considering it from the creatures, from the inanimate objects, so giving all of that a chance to actually narrate what is there. In order to create the content, we didn't want to create it ourselves. We'd identified sort of like where these voices might be, but we wanted to work with the local community, so we went into Havering College and we basically took over a geology lesson, slightly random, and we had quite a lot of learning as a result of that. But we went in, we had 3 things for them to do. Thank you. So there was a writing task. So the writing task said, please have a look at the creatures, the objects and the visitors, take a perspective, write a very short narrative that they might actually say about this site. So what we were after here, we were after small snippets, single sentences, in order to be able to say, right, how is this site speaking? So Rosa wrote some of the some examples out for the students and worked with them. We worked in groups for about 10-15 minutes each. She worked with a group for 50 minutes each, and then we rotated them round. On reflection, what we'd do now is we'd actually work with a group for longer and actually choose people that were specifically interested in writing or in art projects or in sounds. But it was all very sort of like, let's see how we can use this time as creatively as possible. The visual task, I'd come across this artist that's working in Kharkiv in Ukraine, and she'd been drawing on top of the sites, photographs of the bombed sites throughout the war, and just to bring the everyday lives back into that town. And it's an incredibly powerful project, not least because of the fact that you actually see through these characters and see through these spaces. And it struck me as being something that you could really use with augmented reality to be able to understand that the digital is overlaying and not actually pretend it's a part of it. So I gave the students some examples, had them practice that style, and then they worked with tracing paper on top of objects and voices to be able to relay a part of the scene that was interesting to them as well. With the sounds, Rich asked them to actually write down and identify the source, a location, a type of sound and a length, and then took those and produced sounds from that. And then the project goals really were to develop the assets. The more we could find out about augmented reality, how it worked, what we wanted to do with it was great, but it was the asset development that we wanted to test out. So these are some scans from some of the drawings that the students did, so you can see where they'd actually traced to understand how the lines worked, and then actually created some other assets themselves. We have a full list of names, and we explained the project to them to actually say, we'd like you to be the people that are developing this asset. It's your augmented reality, it's not ours, you're the people that live here. Again, with that goal of enabling them to potentially be interested to visit that site. From that, I could take those images and create these elements, these assets that could be used. And then also, in working through the augmented reality using Adobe Aero, what I did was then thought, well, okay, if you're actually having an animal speak, how do you differentiate it from the other background creatures? And that was to sort of like bring it to life into colour. And I'll show you a little bit of that in a minute. The texts are really quite beautiful and quite poignant, and we've taken them completely verbatim in terms of what they are. We haven't managed to sort of like get all of them together yet, but the vole, the rusted, brittle barges, rats scurrying across their forgotten homes, pipets fly high, watching us voles hide. The water rats are but small moving dots in my eye. And there's an element here of these multiple voices actually that come in, and the barge, I'm no longer afloat, but I remember when I was free to move, gliding, transporting, fulfilling my purpose. These are elements that we would not have been able to develop ourselves, and I think that's where the sort of like the beautiful connection part comes into it. There's more here. In order to get those texts, the idea decided just to put them onto speech bubbles so that they could come up within the augmented experience. And then Rich has some sounds. Part of the tech issue just now was that we couldn't get the sounds to work, but I've got them on my computer if somebody wants to listen to them later. I think we'll need to leave that for now. It's a shame because they're very therapeutic sounds as well. Oh no! Hey. You have to figure out which one you think it is. So the idea for the AR mock-up, just to give you an idea about what this would look like, there's the phone as you'd see it on your phone, and then this is how you'd actually be holding it in the landscape. So you get a sense that you're actually looking through your phone. What's appearing on top of it are these drawings. And then the idea is that you would click on something, say you clicked on the cute water bowl here, and then as a result of that, you would get the little creature that came up. It told you its narrative, and then you could click again for the sound, and then the sound would come up as well. So you've got this sort of like multiple building sensation for an environment that you're in. These could be targeted, so you set them off actually because they're in a certain geolocation. You could use QR codes, and also potentially have them for iPads, so that if people wanted to watch in their homes, you could just have the image as the background in there, so that it brings that environment into being as well. The next steps is to actually look for some feedback. Go back to college, go back to the community, find out what they think about it, really interrogate the idea about visitor attractions, what that means, how that might work in a context like this, really look at interaction design, get somebody specialist on board rather than us experimenting with what we've got there, and really work with somebody in sort of like digital design to get that AR experience working. And that's it. So thank you for bearing with us today.
Thank you so much, Kate. Any questions about the project?
Oh, good.
Well, lots.
Holly.
Just one, I'm also doing sort of AR, but we're using the HoloLens. I wondered, are you sticking to using people's phones? Do you think?
I think so, only because it's that. I think the target audience for this was either young kids, and if they're going out, if the only way you can get them out is with a phone, then use that phone to your advantage to actually get them to explore a local area. Rosa and I sat and chatted over summer, so you could even take some of these characters and turn them into 3D bouncing, moving, animated objects.
Yeah.
And actually really have fun with how they actually work in that environment. So you could actually target it specifically depending on which age was looking at it. But yeah, I think the market or the concept that we've got is definitely for phones at the moment. Just because it's in that space, and I want that space is as important as what's happening on the screen.
Yes.
I just really, how did you actually do it? Like, you know what I mean? Like the actual practice, like the like educational technology. Did you work with like technologists, and did you just make that? You coded it yourself?
I've put it into Adobe Aero, so I just bought a Skillshare subscription, learned how to use Aero and stuck it in there. But all these are mock-ups using Photoshop. But you get an idea of how it works, don't you?
Yeah. I'm just like, I don't even know where I'd begin or even afford someone who knew how to do that.
It's been a long learning curve, but it's been really interesting going through it to actually figure out what the parameters are. The fact that it likes square shapes for some reason, like square PNGs, like who would have known, you know?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned this being a prototype as a project, so I was just interested in sort of what element of Canvas's works you're seeing as sort of reproducible.
I think it's a methodology that's reproducible, but also a stylistic approach to be able to say that there are various other sites around the creative estuary that will have similar landscapes and that you can bring out local environments, there's multiple voices, you can work with local schools to generate the content for it. So there's a whole series of minor projects inside here that should be sustainable, that if you're creating assets, you then get programmers just to put in the assets and the new version comes out with new assets.
I mention this because I work with the Chase Doctoral Training Partnership, and so one could envisage a format for a placement project, say for a PhD student that could fit within that. So thank you, that's really interesting.
Now can we just very quickly, yes, please.
It's more a statement rather than a question. But just as a, I was particularly taken by the Ukrainian example, okay, and some of the quality marking there, and I was looking into how you measure immeasurable, intangible loss around the cultural heritage. And I think there are real potentials for this. You know, a lot of my work is in climate change coast issues around Haysborough as an example. You know, so kind of recognising that we will not necessarily be able to change what's going to happen, but actually seeing that, welcoming it into the room whether you like it or not, and then maybe, you know, building stories and narratives as a way of actually dealing with some of those intangible cultural losses.
Yes, exactly, and thank you for bringing that up. I mean, it is there's a poignant element in there in accepting that transience, but also I think from this morning's talk there's an element of hope within there as well that comes to the fore with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Virginia, you are up, and then let's do a little tech swap here. Okay, so on to Lavinia. Is it Bryden or Bryden?
Yeah, Bryden.
Bryden. and Rob Barker, who's there. They are going to present their project Unfiltered Coast. And so like before, I just want to briefly introduce them so you understand what their research focus is on. Lavinia is a senior lecturer in the School of Arts at the University of Kent. Her research centers on issues of place, space, and the environment in and of the arts. This includes audience development for regional arts venues and heritage sites, the impact of location filming and cultural tourism on local communities, the representation of places on screen and page, and eco-critical arts practice. Current research projects that speak to these interests are Unfiltered Coast, engaging young people in coastal climate change, which was sponsored by the HRC 2021-22, and Liminal Spaces, parentheses, and then close parentheses, use spaces, question mark, which was sponsored by Creative Estuary in 21-22. Lavinia is also working as a cultural evaluator for Creative Estuary's Skills Development Project, Regeneration 2031. I'm also going to present Rob, and I must preface that my comments are directly cribbed from a YouTube video that I found of him that was introducing his research, so such as it is. Rob is lecturer in chemistry and forensic science and innovation lead for the Division of Natural Sciences. His research sits at the interface between physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering. At its core, it's about developing new techniques in order to understand nature. This comes from looking at nature at a very small level, from a nanoscale up, to a full system-wide scale of understanding. The motivation here is to design new materials, new manufacturing processes, and taking what nature does so well, using intelligent chemistry and the integration of various techniques that have an impact on human nature and on the world around us. And what brought him to this project today is his interest in engagement, engagement in audiences and particularly place-based engagement. So I turn it over to you now.
All right, thanks. I'm also just going to mention briefly Declan, who couldn't be with us today. He's from the School of English and has basically been the literary thread of this project, and was also going to talk about querying the estuary, which is his Creative Estuary funded project, because we were part of that project, part of this project was looking at methodologies, and we were looking at walking as a methodology in particular, and there was kind of connections to be made there, and also how that then led to zine making, and there's particular reasons for that as well. So I'm just going to briefly focus then on the Unfiltered Coast project, which was, as was stated, an AHRC project, and it had a very specific timeline. It was COP26, so it was the tightest of tight timelines. So it started with this kind of idea of we had to engage young people. I think the call was 14 to 18. We slightly elevated that to 20-year-olds. That was part of a youth focus group that we went out to, who sort of said, why is it so restricted to 18-year-olds? Actually, they wanted us at one point to go to 25, and we thought the HEC wouldn't accept that. So we kind of had some slippage in around the 19-year-olds, basically. And it was using the Kent coastline as a case study. So to think through engaging young people in a coastal area, because we are in a coastal area, and think through coastal climate change in particular. And the initial idea, myself and Rob actually initially sitting down, was the idea of how to make environmental science engaging, and how to use it using artistic methods. And for me, in my research, walking is both, I think, a research methodology for me thinking through things, but I see it also as an artistic practice in and of itself. So for me, walking and a sort of creative workshop or walkshop was a really valuable method of sort of connecting young people with the landscape, with the sites that they could see, that we could point to, that we could feel and touch and have all that sensory experience with. But actually the walking in itself should be creative and give rise to other creative energies and impulses, so they could take that how they wanted in terms of a composition of a photograph, or writing about the sensory experiences they had, and had little tasks for that. We wanted to take a really bottom-up approach from the very get-go. So although we were writing the proposal that got the funding, at the very start we said we would engage a community partner, which was, we have the Gulbenkian Arts Centre in the University of Kent, and they already have a youth board, so we thought it's a very time-bound project. It would be good to get them on board quickly, because these things, as we mentioned earlier, to build relationships with the community, you need a lot of time. This call went out in July, and we got word of funding in September, and we had to do something by November. Like, and if anyone's ever done ethics approval for young people, well, you can see why we needed a project extension, basically. But we did do something for COP26 in November. We did the workshops then, but then we did need the project extension for the other bits. But I mean, it was super tight. But we had this focus group, and that was really great in terms of getting their ideas. They decided that, okay, it was coastal climate change, but there was particular themes we wanted to pull out. We hadn't really said what locations we wanted yet. We'd been a bit sort of speculative in our proposal, in our application, and also the different creative activities. We kind of knew we wanted to do workshops, but we didn't know maybe what specific exercises or activities we would do and how long these workshops would take. So getting a youth board or pulling from a youth board to have ones that were particularly interested in environmental concerns was really useful, because then we started to, it kind of upends your own perceptions of the place and what you think people will be interested in and they're not, and things like that. And then also the other challenge we had, which I'll come to, is kind of maintain interest from the participants. So the idea being we do the workshops, but there needs to be sort of an output for them to sort of be invested. So the idea was we would start some work as they walked, composition of a photograph, but then they could go and retake it a later date, or manipulate it in some way, and then we would have this exhibition. And the plan is we've had it in the Gulbenkian in Canterbury, but we're going to have it in Ramsgate at a later date. We hope to fit it in this sort of year frame, but it's not. But we've bagged some time in Ramsgate, so we will be there later on. Okay, so the themes that emerged, well, it was contamination, it was shortage, and it was flooding. And the big topic of conversation was the sewage. So when we had initially probably been speculative about contamination, we probably thought, oh, plastic is on everyone's agenda, the Dayton Attenborough effect and that kind of thing. And actually, of course, in that summer before we got the project funding, all the conversation was really about sewage, and of course these young people hadn't been able to swim. So that sort of was where their heads were at with contamination. And they were also, because some of them live in coastal areas and around coastal areas, more aware of the flooding as well. And then we drew up a kind of a long list and then a short list of locations in Kent, in the coastal communities. Our group was more familiar with North Kent, so they kind of sort of had a bias towards there that I think then we sort of mitigated slightly as the project investigators. Particularly, we were thinking about, well, somewhere like Ramsgate, the kind of the projection of the flooding there, for instance, is really important. The idea also that we had wanted to target places that reach the university a little bit further out, to target places as well where the young people didn't go into further education, and to try and start to build those connections as well. So we settled on Ramsgate and Folkestone after kind of like a kind of group conversation. And then the different activities were discussed. Some were quite ambitious, and I kind of loved what was being said earlier about having ambition, but there's also a sense of really you've got to be accessible as well with young people. So it was kind of like, yes, it would be great if we could do all this, but let's just keep it quite low-fi, low equipment. You can just turn up with a phone, you can turn up with a pen and paper, and you can still do it. And so we built in all these kind of different accessibility measures, and this includes financial accessibility as well. And we had a pot to help with financial access as well. And that, of course, we had scoped out and walked the route and thought about mobility issues as well, should they have arisen. So it was agreed kind of no special equipment was required, that anyone could kind of turn up, fill out a consent form, and that we would do this kind of 2-hour workshop. And we had these little activities, these exercises about, thinking about the sensory engagement and kind of then trying to write down those senses, to articulate that. We then kind of did little exercises around protest slogans for posters, because of course the COP26 had loads of posters around. We did think about how to take an image that could speak to quite a big climate change issue. What's around you that you can actually speak to it? So things like, again, making visible these issues, as Kate was saying earlier. So some of the challenges. Well, because we had a youth group and we really wanted their voices throughout it, we kept going back to them to kind of sign off on everything we had. And as I've just said, we had like 6 weeks. So going back for even like marketing posters and double checking, it it just created this time lag, which it's so important these events have built in time to create proper relationships, and we didn't really have it. So maybe, something maybe more modest, because it just kept delaying. The other thing that I didn't know was if you put COP26 in any sort of advert, social media advert, it gets rejected. So in terms of our promotion, we put out all these social media adverts, but because we put COP26, they got rejected, and we had to kind of repost our adverts. So we had lower uptake than we had hoped. And again, with young people as well, the idea is they move on very fast. So to gain their interest, but then to also maintain it is really tricky, especially when it wasn't tied to a school project. So I'm thinking about going into the schools that was just said is a really good way. If you get a teacher on board and it builds into a termly project, it's so much better than just doing something so random. But of course, we were also timed down to COP26. We did actually engage with the school in the end, but that was sort of a fortuitous addition. And then of course it was weather. I was doing a workshop, or we were doing a workshop, and of course the weather was going to be an issue. So it was windy, really windy in Folkestone. It was bitterly cold, and it rained in Ramsgate. And we had people sign up who didn't turn up, presumably. One of the reasons we can presume is because of the weather. So yeah, these were all challenges, but in keeping with this idea of maybe being a bit more hopeful and some of the positives. So it didn't fulfill all the things we wanted it to do, but lots of positives in that we did find from the feedback that young people found it a good way of an avenue for local activism, particularly around COP26, when some of them were maybe too young to go up to London, or we were still in kind of COVID times and people were not sure about travel, that this was much more local and pertinent and gave them a way to engage that was much more nearby. There was definitely the idea of seeing the coastline anew. So the artwork, which hopefully you have perused outside, I'm really pleased that we were able to bring so much of it down here, was about them sort of, I think, not that they didn't know some of these things, but kind of connecting up some dots. So connecting up, you know, that if they walk the bit of Folkestone, they can kind of see over to Dungeness and those wind turbines. So Sophie's image, which we use for the project poster as the sort of faded image now, that's a quote from her. And that positive element, she did document, she also did the photograph of the kind of the building in Folkestone that's right on the beach, and that question of how precarious that infrastructure is. So there was kind of documentation of the sort of, you know, the challenges maybe of happening with the environment in that area. But then she also created this acrylic painting entitled It Wish You Were Here, thinking about there are positive things going on, and but that idea of like more people need to join that. And I really liked seeing, for her, those two pieces. And then also there was another young artist who, you know, took a photograph of, I think it's out there, the sort of plastic on the beach, again documenting, you know, contamination on the beach. But then later this summer he sent me that Seagull Assembly one, that's what he's titled it, and I thought that was a really witty title. So through the different activities we did, because we were saying, you know, sometimes just document something, and sometimes we were like, play with it, where's the humour, or not forcing them into the humour, but sort of playing with different techniques that he has on his own sort of developed, like more witty images that he's been sending me over the summer. And it's been really lovely to see his voice as an artist develop. And then also think about with environmentalism that we need positive stories, but we also need positive modes. So I think building in humour and wit, when we have environmentalism as a movement, it's often very negative, but to build in these positive modes so we can engage with it, because it can be quite fearful to engage with these really big challenges sometimes. So that, I think the young people really brought that kind of energy to the project, and it's been really lovely to see what they've done. And then the fact that some of them were really not artists, they just come because it was something on a Saturday. And so they didn't have this artistic impulse, but no matter the skill or the technology they had with them, every participant came up with a slogan for a poster, and came up with, you know, an image, and played around with that. And hence we have all these really witty social media posts as well. So again, the idea that everyone can be creative, and it's just about engaging at a different level, or pulling whatever interest they have. In fact, you know, there was the Paragirls in the windswept Folkestone. I mean, yeah, they didn't create artwork for the exhibition, but they were on it with the social media posts, like loads of their slogans, and working through that. And then finally, finding ways to bring the young people's voices throughout the project's lifetime. So we did have the exhibition, and every time I talk about it, I try and bring the artwork. If the young people can't be here, that artwork is here, and that was really important if I was going to speak here today, that I brought the artwork so that their voices are represented. We also hope to have one of our undergraduates who was kind of a project assistant with us, who wrote the permits out there, and we also built into the project proposal that we would have this link from the 14-year-old right the way through to the academics, so that we would have undergraduates as project assistants, we would have a young professional service staff member as a public engagement expert, and that we would really try and create this kind of, I guess, a pipeline to stop this kind of, these are the academics and these are the young people, and it sort of filtered through. So Kit was hoping to come today, but it's welcome week and they've just gone into a postgraduate, so a bit swamped. But that's one of the ways we try to have that link and not kind of create these kind of two silos. The idea that if we had feedback postcards, we would use the artwork. So anything like the social media posts, use the artwork. We keep trying to promote their voices, their artwork in different ways. So we did the feedback postcards were like the social media posts or bits of the artwork. And then also trying to then think through the exhibitions can be quite you can pass through them without really engaging with them sometimes. So we have built then, again, we didn't initially think of this, but it became a sort of evolving idea of to do zine making workshops. So we trialled one, well Declan trialled one, and I'm going to do some more at the weekend. With the idea that the zines, you kind of see some of the artwork, and that helps prompt, and you make the zine in sort of response to sort of our exhibition catalogue. We didn't have a formal catalogue, so we're kind of using the zines, and then the young people have the option of donating into the project. So there's this kind of nice continuation of the project going forward. Both with the walking and with the zine making, it was really important that these are lo-fi DIY art forms that anyone could get involved with, and that also with sort of zine making, part of its kind of ethos is there's no right or wrong way. The idea of failure, the idea of making a mess is part and parcel of it. I don't know if I had another slide. Oh yeah, that's it. That's it.
So let me just briefly introduce Julia Devonshire and Cavis Clayton.
This is Mark Cater, actually, in the place of Cavis Clayton.
Wait,
and Marianne.
wait, what?
The reveal!
I'm the sort of final shoe-in.
Okay, well, hey, whatever works.
Actually critical
Okay.
to the whole project.
So you're throwing me for a run, but okay. So Julia works with Cavis, who's not here, to run Original Projects, which is an organization that uses contemporary art to develop a proactive creative presence in Great Yarmouth, where they live and work. And it builds fresh place-based connections and collaborations that uncover, support, create, and promote cultural assets. And this has taken the form of public art commissions, the creating of Yarmonics, a sonic art festival.
This weekend.
Finding Immersion, which you are going to be talking about today, a biennial photography festival, producing podcasts, curating exhibitions, running workshops, organizing walking tours, and more. Together with running Original Projects, both Julia and Cavis are responsible for external commissions and freelance opportunities in their respective specialisms, providing consultancy, mentoring, project management, technical support, and more. And apologies for not having the intro for you.
All right, we'll introduce him throughout.
Okay,
so it's
voila.
fine.
So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sort of like do it as effectively and efficiently as possible. So if you want to go, you've already announced us and given people a little bit of an insight about what we do. We've been practicing for the past 6 years, moved our entire lives to Great Yarmouth, and delivered a number of ambitious programmes and projects that build local creative capacity and develop reach into the national arts and cultural infrastructure. So the reason that what brings us here is bringing the Finding Emerson exhibition, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. We've been invited to show that through our relationship with Marianne Arribas Tome, who would be here today, but she's in Iceland, to bring this body of work to UEA, via the Creative UEA, under the Creative UEA banner. If anyone doesn't know about that, you should look it up. It's sort of some sort of outreach that connects with creative industries more widely. So that's happening in the autumn. It's very much under development, and that isn't the last final edit of the flyer. So this will see contemporary art photographs from Great Yarmouth displayed alongside images of East Anglia by pioneering Victorian photographer Peter Henry Emerson. So this display will be accompanied by activities such as talks in partnership with different university departments, as well as the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Art, and support trips from Great Yarmouth to the campus that enable the community of Great Yarmouth contributors and collaborators connect with the university, experience the work in a new location, and indeed in a completely different context to that which the programme that conceived it was rooted. So the relationship that Finding Emerson project has been in developing with the UEA foregrounds interesting, unintended and secondary connections and observations that are generated or revealed that feel pertinent to conversations around collaborative coast and what art and culture as a driver for placemaking and levelling up can mean in practice. So I'm going to hand over to, this is Mark Cater. Is that the next one? This is the artist and collaborator, and you can talk about yourself now.
Yeah, so very quickly, I was a practicing photographer. I set up base in Great Yarmouth about 6-7 years ago, and at the same time put together a thing called Utter Nonsense, which is really trying to deliver a better understanding towards the language of photography, not the technical aspects, but purely a more discursive interpretation of contemporary and historical photography practices. The reason I then joined up with Julia and Caboose, original projects, with the idea of putting on a photographic festival. We quickly realized that we didn't want to become yet another town or city with a, you have the Oxford Photographic Festival, we have the Bristol Photographic Festival. Somehow Great Yarmouth is going to get lost in that. So we hit on the idea of utilizing Emerson, Peter Henry Emerson, and calling it the Finding Emerson Photographic Festival. Emerson's important in the history of photography because he was latterly seen as a sort of proto-modernist, and by sort of the countries who are willing to take on board the idea of a new medium, like sort of America and Germany, they very much saw him as a founding father of modern photography. And yet in this country, because he was a little bit of a rebel, a little bit of an outsider, very anti-establishment, although he was part of the establishment, and was willing to define photography as a fine art in its own right, plus write about that, he was able to dictate a way and a thought process that the Americans and sort of continental Europe really went with. In this country, when he sort of gave up photography, they absolutely buried him. They saw him as a little bit of a loudmouth, a little bit, his views were not taken on board particularly well, and we sort of lost track of him as an individual until Nancy Newell, who was an American art historian, wrote this book about Emerson and his fight for photography as a fine art. And the reason why we wanted to utilize his name, because all of his work was based in Great Yarmouth and in the surrounding areas of Norfolk and East Anglia. So we were able to then have a 2-day festival. We wanted to work from ground up. So, we wanted to begin quite small. And we were able to put on 2 seminars. We had about 5 sites where we were exhibiting either his work or work from local photographers. And we did some sound recordings of his work in Marsh Leaves, which is one of his books that he wrote with photographs. He was one of the first photographers actually to put image and text together as one. We were able to unveil a blue plaque in his honor, which was unveiled by his great-great-grandson, who interestingly thought I saw him, Emerson, his great-great-grandfather, through rather rose-tinted glasses. He was clean, although an excellent photographer and very progressive in his thoughts, like all such individuals, perhaps not a particularly good father figure at home. we were also able to construct a very large outside installation of about 100 yards along the sea wall with the help of a local businessman who was willing for us to utilize his wall space. And latterly, I'm going to talk about the open.
This is part 2, this is the open, yeah.
Latterly, we were able to then do an open photographic competition within the borough, which was sort of centered around his ideals, which was place and people. And we had a really actually very good response. And we were able to put on 80 images, 80 prints taken by people within the borough at Prime Yard Gallery for about sort of 6 weeks, which is really exciting. Huge interest in that, and had huge feedback because of that. Because people, there's a funny thing about photography, it sort of sits in 2 camps, amateur and professional, and yet that whole bit in the middle, which is where people who want to express themselves through the use of photography sort of get forgotten about. And it was really interesting to see the sort of the quality of work that's coming through from people who felt they didn't have a voice, and this gave them the opportunity to have a voice. And not only that, to put it up in quite large scale. I mean, these don't necessarily show, but these are sort of 8 foot by 4 foot panels, which we strung out all the way down here, you know, along the promenade, which was a little bit of an area which wasn't particularly well respected within the community, although it's, you know, it's a nice place to walk. So that helped. People in the local community were really, really interested with what we were doing, very supportive of it, and has actually led to an extension of that wall with another artist working on a completely different agenda, doing illusionistic paintings. But it means that we've got a sort of semi-permanent site which we can now make into an outdoor art installation, which always helps that dialogue with a wide audience, because not everybody likes going into galleries, whereas having an outdoor installation, it's sort of able to sort of cross that barrier.
It's also unlocked an open invitation via elected members. We're talking about councillors and leverage with them before to then manifest this further into the borough. There's always a concern that these things are always within the Great Yarmouth bit, but actually there's a whole bunch of other outer beaches that often get neglected when it comes to the cultural manifestation of cultural product and offer elsewhere. Finding Emerson also has a future, doesn't it? It's there's a 5-year project to put a digital archive online and also kind of continue this portrait of the town and maybe manifest things in the future, as well as your monthly photo socials that you host in our Prime Yard Gallery. Prime Yard is a gallery and an art space that we run in the former Debenhams. A few of them around the country, I bet, but it's definitely sort of given us a window into the community, but also it's an accessible space, it's an unintimidating space, but also a home to 30 artists and a growing community of practitioners. So that's helping with the building of capacity, which is essential. We talked about this earlier, that how do you do it from a standing start? You just use the assets that you've got and make them work. So thank you. I'm just going to go into a bit just to round things off, and actually show people a little bit more about the work. Oh gosh, this is me when it's my snazzy slide deck. That this is just so I don't have to keep pressing every time I change the image. So these are interdispersed with actual Emerson images. So you can see that there's some material here that's been generated by the community, and so just to make that comparison, I suppose, between those kind of photographic sensibilities. But wanting to kind of bring this chat or this presentation back to the kind of theme that myself and Marianne, who's a Spanish teacher, and she's actually on our board as well, thinking about translation and how this project kind of works in multiple and unintended ways. So kind of wanting to kind of give you a lens to which to view this case study. Kind of thinking about our coastal context in Great Yarmouth. So Great Yarmouth is not untypical to coastal locations, and is a place that has historically been shaped by seasonality and extremes. So typically, again, an official line might say, at one point, the port was one of the richest towns in the country with a thriving fishing and domestic holiday trade. It now experiences high levels of economic deprivation, yet also hosts the highest paid jobs in Norfolk, predominantly occupied by non-residents. Geographically, it's a liminal patchwork of coastline, quayside and urban areas that layers sectors and industries. Leisure and tourism meets marine energy, meets engineering, advanced manufacturing and port logistics. Real challenges, but so much opportunity. So the narrative deploying the demographic, social, economic and environmental challenges and opportunities typically used to build a case to attract inward investments and recently proved very successful, securing schemes including Towns Fund, Future High Streets Fund and status as an Arts Council priority place and a DCMS Living Up Place of Culture. So perhaps less celebrated and even shunned in these establishment data-driven evidence-based storytelling, which tends to focus on deprivation and bidding for transformative investments, are the many intangible and physical characteristics that decline has impacted, revealed in abundant physical and social patina that the ebb and flow of generational fortunes have left on place, and the diverse communities that currently call it home. So it's not to say that local government strategies and plans haven't made a successful moves to place culture, heritage and tourism as a driver for regeneration and economic growth, but this vision and delivery is often in the hands of usual players that can prioritise placemaking projects that mirror cultural signatures of our seaside. In our location, it will be circus performance, herring heritage, and civic life such as architecture and medieval townscapes, and perhaps othering diverse communities through targeted projects. Such attempts at placemaking often gloss over nuanced contemporary lived reality that gives Great Yarmouth its true identity, not without challenges, but a place that speaks many languages, is interconnected, honest about itself, its stories, its personalities, and able to breed understanding and therefore its own resilience. So to reflect on finding Emerson, its emergent dimensions, cultural meanings, and how it contributes value beyond its celebration of photographic image. So it's historically and geographically grounded, celebrates a significant photographer with a very strong relationship to place, yet uncelebrated locally. With a firm belief in the naturalistic photography and truth to nature, Emerson rallied against his contemporaries and their studio constructs to often include staged rustic scenes, as you've mentioned, and feed into idealised Victorian notions of the countryside. So we see that often in our tourism brochures, don't we, the equivalent of that nowadays. So finding Emerson encourages all comers to apply his radical attitude and method to image making and portraying plays. It provides an outlet for local people, equal opportunity to engage in photography and use it as a vehicle to record, express and make visible the world as they see it, with no requirement of technical or conceptual ability or discipline, resulting in pure, unsynthesized, non-excluding, non-propagandist, open visual dialogue. And two, it's developed by and from the grassroots community and in response to the community needs and desires. The body of image, which as you can see is manifested as a tool for local people to share their perceptions of the place where they live, showing the familiar, the funny, the interesting from behind the camera lens, non-verbally, and removing any language or educational barrier. Following Emerson's vehement advocacy for democracy of image, the work in Finding Emerson foregrounds the agency of local people in Great Yarmouth, allowing them to express creatively and critically how they see themselves and the place they inhabit and are intimately connected with. The very diverse expression of a place in our region captured through this collection of photographs can catalyse an authentic communication and conversation about environment, local perspectives, local people's voices and connections against the backdrop and despite top-down regeneration efforts. Whether an intended outcome or not, knowing people and places through their own interpretations has huge potency for framing an unquestionable lived reality and a community-owned narrative that data top-down cultural commissioning often denies, missing vital opportunities to inspire others to share their stories or to engage in furthering true, unmediated narratives about life in a place for future generations to reflect on. So finally, number 3, it is also responding to the external opportunities such as connections to new audiences and multidisciplinary interpretations and knowledge that an academic context might generate. Taking Finding Emerson from A to B to the UEA and facilitating the integration of this material into the creative UEA programme will provide opportunities for audiences unfamiliar with Great Yarmouth, or those who know it from a distance or have second-hand preconceptions, to reflect and engage outwards. Through captured audience feedback, it can also generate dialogical connection across communities in the region. So regional projects are not a nonsense. We can unlock our productive long-term relationships with UEA and different courses and departments, but strategically taking into account all this and its additional meanings and dimensions, Finding Emerson can provide a questioning instrument for example, removed from its original context and speak to regional communities and faculties in a way that proximity to Great Yarmouth and indeed the original project's Nothing Nonsense locus by itself does not. Shown within the academic setting, perhaps the images will bring a very personal narrative and dialogue with viewers and can awaken fresh discourse as to what community engagement and development can mean and serve to interrogate the creative and practical opportunity for creating knowledge around levelling up and other agendas so often implemented from afar, and explore ways for those experiencing inequalities at a local level to influence and challenge policy and programmes. So we're quite excited about what this next bit can offer.
Thank you very
Sorry
much.
I had to read it.